Protect your DNA. BioPQQ can promote formation of new mitochondria. Infowarsstore.com.
Today, Donald Trump announced his replacement for General Flynn. It's H.R. McMaster. As the LA Times points out, he's an Army strategist. He's the new National Security Advisor. And of course, this is a replacement for Flynn, who last week we saw was taken out in a political assassination by the CIA, the Washington Post, and perhaps Vice President Pence. We'll talk more about that later. McMaster has served since July 2014 as director of the Army Capabilities Integration Center, but he's perhaps best known as the author of a 1997 book, Dereliction of Duty, that explores the military's responsibility for the U.S. failure during the Vietnam War. And as we look at this and the descriptions of this, I think it may give us an interesting insight into the man and what his role in the Trump administration may be. Of course, the subtitle to this book, Dereliction of Duty, is Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Lies That Led to Vietnam. And of course, we know from the documentary The Fog of War, we saw Robert McNamara, before he died, admitting that the Gulf of Tonkin was a false flag, that in fact there had been no attack, but that was only the beginning of the lies. McMaster went on to look at what was going on within the administration, went through all the different memos. It was a very detailed book. It was part of his master's thesis that he got at the University of North Carolina. They say it's considered to be the seminal work on the military's responsibility during Vietnam to confront their civilian bosses when strategy was not working. It says that his thesis proposes the plans and the advice on Vietnam prepared by the nation's military advisors were systematically sidetracked by McNamara. Well, we all know that, but then he goes on to say, as damning as the civilian leaders as he is, McMaster's doesn't blithely exonerate the brass. And of course, I'm reading from a review here that was put up by Amazon.com from the publishers. They didn't heed their own warnings. They acquiesced in McNamara's incrementalist policy in the hope of eventually getting the huge force they diffidently advised would be needed to win. So he hits Johnson, he hits McNamara on the political side of this, but he also hits the generals for not standing up and having a unified strategy, but not speaking out about the obvious failures that were going on here, allowing the politics to play through to the destruction of many lives, quite frankly. But before we move on, let's not forget General Flynn so quickly, because the political assassination of General Flynn will be repeated if we don't look at it more carefully. There's a post this weekend from National Review saying there appears to be no basis at all for a criminal or intelligence probe of General Flynn. They say, why was the FBI investigating him in the first place? They say he was dismissed amid a torrent of mainstream media reporting and disgraceful government leaks. And then they go on to say on what basis, however, was the FBI investigating him? And they say to predicate an investigation under FBI guidelines, there must be good faith suspicion that A, a federal crime has been committed or is being committed, or B, there is a threat to American national security, or C, there's an opportunity to collect foreign intelligence relevant to a priority established by the executive branch. And they said sometimes these overlap, but they take a look at the last category. And they say at first blush, this category seems to be limitless. Yeah, it does. You know, anybody that might have some information that might impinge in some way, shape, or form on national security. Unmooring government investigators from the constraints that normally confine their intrusions on our liberties, for example, snooping, search warrants, interrogations, to situations where there is no real reason to suspect unlawful or dangerous activity. You see, this is a very important point. He was a private citizen. And I hope that the lesson that is learned from this lynching, this political assassination, I hope Donald Trump learns a lesson from this. He needs to not only be careful of the dark state that set this up, but he also needs to take a look at this kind of security state that we have winked and nodded at in the name of national security that can do this type of thing, not only to General Flynn, but to each and every American, and to a president of the United States like Donald Trump eventually as well, if we don't stand for the rule of law, if we don't make them get search warrants, if we don't have to have a reason to investigate somebody, if they can do what we saw with Stalin, bring me the man, I'll find the crime. And that's precisely what happened. Now, as we saw over the weekend, we're going to get to what Vice President Pence said in Europe. But before we leave this, I think it's very important that we understand that it was the Washington Post that was at the center of these revelations about General Flynn. Of course, they were given this information. That was the newspaper that it was leaked to. Going back to December of 2013, a little over 3 years ago, Alternet talked about Jeff Bezos and his connection with the Washington Post and the CIA at the nexus of this. And remember that as we had the lead up to Trump becoming president, he was meeting with a lot of people. He had a meeting with a lot of people out of California, people who were part of Silicon Valley. And of course, Jeff Bezos was there at the table, but at the far end of the table in the corner. And of course, Donald Trump has also said that he was going to look into antitrust violations of the Washington Post. Actually, antitrust violations of Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, because the Washington Post was targeting him during the campaign. And so he kind of pushed back on that. But understand the connection between Jeff Bezos and the CIA. Now, he bought the Washington Post, and yet, as is pointed out in Alternet over 3 years ago, they keep his Washington Post readers in the dark about his connection to the CIA. Now, he bought the Washington Post for $250 million, but the CIA has a $600 million contract with the CIA as of 3 years ago. They point out that's more than twice as much as Bezos paid to buy the Washington Post to start with. And, of course, he said we look forward at the time, 3 years ago, to a very successful relationship with the CIA. And they say in Alternet, as Amazon's majority owner and the Post's only owner, Bezos stands to gain a lot more if his newspaper does less ruffling and more soothing of CIA feathers. They say the media watch group FAIR pointed out what happened after WikiLeaks published State Department cables. They said WikiLeaks was booted from Amazon's web hosting service, AWS. So at the height of public interest in what WikiLeaks was publishing, readers were unable to access the WikiLeaks website. So we're going to talk about NATO here in a moment. But I got to say that the alliance NATO is far less pertinent to what's going on in the world right now than the CIA's alliances with the Washington Post and Jeff Bezos, or the CIA's alliance with Saudi Arabia. That's really what we should be focused on. I think that Donald Trump is right when he said that NATO really is obsolete, but what is not obsolete is the dark, deep state that is represented by this nexus of the Washington Post and the CIA, Jeff Bezos. Now, Vice President Pence went to Munich, of all places, this weekend, and this is happening even, as was reported today, even Norway is riding a populist wave of politics. We've got Marine Le Pen at a new high at 27% in a three-way race. The other two candidates have 20% as it's coming up. As I've reported before, we have people in France saying we've looked at Brexit, we've looked at Trump's election, and we believe that for the first time, we can really change things here in France. And yet, with all of that happening, we have the vice president go to Munich and declare his undying love for the European Union. Strange thing indeed. And so we'll look at what he did on Saturday when he was at Munich, and then we're going to talk about what happened today in Brussels. So Saturday he goes to Munich, just like Neville Chamberlain went to meet with Adolf Hitler in Munich and sold out Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, and shortly after that it was invaded. We now have Pence going to Munich and saying that, first of all, the U.S.'s commitment to NATO is unwavering. Remember, Donald Trump said, I think that it is obsolete for two reasons. Number one, the member states are not paying the 2% that they agreed to, so they're not contributing to their own defense. They want us to pull all the weight for them. But also because the real threat to us is Islamic extremist jihadi terrorism, not necessarily Russia. But that is all starting to change now with the changing Trump cabinet. Pence said, Europe's defense requires your commitment as much as ours. First, he talked about the fact that they weren't holding up their end economically. He said Germany, for instance, Europe's largest economy, now only spends 1.2% of its GDP on its military, not the 2% that is required by the NATO agreement. Okay, now they went on. If we look at this in context, we understand that the United States is spending 36% of all the military expenditures in the world. We're spending far more than the next 5 or 6 countries combined in terms of military expense, and yet Germany only spends 1.2% of its GDP. But he went far from saying that NATO is obsolete. Pence said that while some NATO members met the spending goal, many others, including some of our largest allies, still lack a credible path and we expect the allies to meet that goal. He went on, however, and as he was pressing them to pay up with NATO, he began to reassure them on the European Union. As Reuters points out, EU welcomes Pence's assurance of Trump's support. Now, this happened today. He went to Brussels, and as The Guardian put it, Pence's speech could have been given and written by Joe Biden. That's how bad it was. That's how counterproductive it is to what Donald Trump has been saying. And so the people in the EU, as well as I think many of us in America who voted for President Trump, want to know really who's in charge here. Is this some kind of a new coup that's being set up? Is Pence setting himself up to be the guy that's left in charge after Donald Trump is taken out? Is he going to be George H.W. Bush to Ronald Reagan? They say, this is Reuters, a month after Donald Trump caused alarm by renewing his endorsement of Brexit and suggesting that others may follow Britain out of the EU, Pence went with his hat in his hand to Brussels, saying that he had come to the home of the European Union with a message from the president of strong commitment to continue cooperation and partnership with the European Union. And immediately, Donald Tusk, who chairs the European Council of EU leaders, told reporters that Pence had given him affirmative actions to 3 questions on Trump's support. He supports the current system of international law, that he supports NATO, and that he supports, quote, the idea of a united Europe. EU officials said that they were encouraged by what they called Pence's clear assurances, including on U.S. backing for holding the European Union together after Brexit. See, it's not a misreading to say this. Everybody is saying, hey, look, he's saying that he wants to keep the European Union together. He doesn't want to see anybody else leave. That is not what we've heard from Trump. That is not what we need to see happen in terms of fighting globalism. And they say they'll watch closely to see how far Trump's actions match his deputy's words. One official said, we got everything we were looking for. I don't think American voters are getting what they were looking for with this kind of speech from Vice President Trump. And immediately, he was bitch slapped by Tusk, the European official that he met with privately, who came out and railed against, quote, the brute force, egoism, and arrogance. And they said, and this was characterized by the Express in UK as a series of jaw-dropping remarks which will be interpreted as a very thinly veiled assault on the Republican commander-in-chief, in other words, President Trump. This is what you get when you try to rebuild bridges. This is what you get when you try to appease people like these globalists. And I think we need to understand and we need to stand by people like Ted Malloch. Now, Ted Malloch has not been named the EU ambassador, but he said that he would not be cowed down, and he said that President Trump would not be cowed down. He said that he had presided over the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and he thought that maybe there was another union that needed to be resolved at the time. And of course, he was talking about the European Union. Now he goes on to Breitbart and talks about how the Financial Times in the UK is attempting a political assassination against him. Of course, there have been those in the European Union who said that they wanted to hold a vote and tell Donald Trump that he could not have Ted Malloch as his EU ambassador. And Ted Malloch said, well, maybe you didn't realize that you don't have a say in this, that we had an election in America. See, that's the essence of American sovereignty. We get to pick our ambassadors. And at the time, many people said, look, we had ambassadors that we sent to Russia who did not agree with communism. We've had ambassadors that we sent to other areas that did not endorse Islam, okay? So it is not necessary for your ambassador to buy into whatever political or religious system is dominant in that country. And so we don't have to have an EU ambassador who buys into globalism. The question is, do we have a vice president who buys into globalism? Now, this was an exclusive at Breitbart. This was written by Ted Malloch. And he said, I seem to have made myself very unpopular with the European Union and its media friends, or are they their cronies? Indeed, there seems to be a concerted attack to get me, spearheaded by the EU's house journal, the Financial Times. He says the EU does not want anyone but a pro-EU U.S. ambassador to go to Brussels. This undemocratic institution wants to force the U.S. to keep things the way they were and deny President Trump his selection and to stop his views from being articulated there. And then he goes down and he looks at all of the petty personal attack type of questions, type of gotcha questions that he was asked. And they tried to contact him multiple times from the Financial Times, and he looks at different things like, did you receive an Emmy Award? In other words, trying to go back and nitpick as to what he did. The video shows no statement by Margaret Thatcher calling you a genius or a global Sherpa, so forth and so on. So what they're trying to do is hit him with a character assassination. And we have to understand that just as we saw happen today in Brussels, 2 days after Pence goes to Munich and declares his undying support and love for NATO and the European Union, that if we try to make peace with the globalists, this is exactly what they're going to do. They're going to turn around and stab us. The concern that I have as we look at this is the fact that Vice President Pence was at the center of this move against Mike Flynn. And that's something, along with this different approach to the EU, that concerns me very much. Stay with us. When we come back, we're going to take a look at border issues and real dollars and cents.
In case you haven't heard, Infowars has become the most influential media outlet in America. We're making freedom go viral. And now we are proud to announce a new weapon in the epic battle against the globalists. Infowars Prime, where you can watch live high-definition feeds of The Alex Jones Show, plus exclusive insider videos from the Infowars crew and behind-the-scenes action. Go to Infowars.com/app and download today. Infowars Prime is available right now for your iPhone or Android. You will have access to exclusive videos that you can't see anywhere else. And that means live coverage of events and breaking news on location as it happens. You can also take advantage of amazing deals from the Infowars store that are only available for Infowars Prime subscribers. That's Infowars Prime at Infowars.com/app. And if you can hear my voice, you are the resistance.